And so I'm very amped up for this. I've been waiting for this for the years because I know our guest has been working on this for quite some time. It is a project very special to her. Dr. Johanna Fernández is assistant professor of history at Baruch College at CUNY, City University of New York. She's the editor of Writing on the Wall, the writings of Mumia Abu-Jamal, and many of us probably know her first and foremost for her tireless work on behalf of the liberation of Mumia. On behalf of many, I want to thank you for all the years of your work on behalf of Mumia. Y'all keep that applause up, presenting her new book, The Young Lords, A Radical History, Johanna Fernández.
Thank you, brother, for that wonderful introduction. I'm just honored to be here. First of all, my book was just born. The official coming out date of the book was February 17th, just Monday, which is also the birthday of Huey P. Newton, I discovered this week. So how do I start? I've been speaking at universities in the last 2 weeks, so I have this formal talk for you, but I guess I'll start by saying that my work around the defense of political prisoners, and in particular the defense of Mumia Abu-Jamal, has hugely informed my perspective and my work. I'm a professor, but I like to tell the folks that I speak to that I'm in the academy and not of it. And this book should have been written within the timeline that the academy establishes for tenure. But this story is so powerful and so complex and so unknown. And it was such a difficult process writing the book that I decided to throw the tenure clock away and write a book that I think is worthy of the incredible history that the Young Lords made. And I just hope that a new generation of revolutionaries and activists will learn from the lessons of struggle last time. So with that, let us begin. But you know what? Let me ask, who knows, who's read the history of the Young Lords or knows something about the Young Lords? Something about the Young Lords. Now, before I start, does anyone have a question that I should keep in mind or answer before I start my remarks? Is there a burning question that you think you want to ask before I start my talk? Sam's got a question. He's been watching me all night long. Any questions off the bat?
Touch base on this. I know you'll go into their view of the Panthers and relationship there between, but as I kind of alluded to, I'm wondering if how much communication there was to the other groups, such as Yellow Tigers and AIM and the rest.
Iwar Right. Right. No, so there was an enormous amount of solidarity in 1969 when the Young Lords emerged. And this was in part a result of the revolutionary character of the period. In 1968, students polled, and I'm going to talk about this, agreed or said that they believed in the importance of building a revolutionary party. So this was a revolutionary period. There were revolutions in the so-called Third World, and solidarity was in many ways, especially among people of color, was the order of the day. So there was a lot of cross-fertilization in the movements. And one of the understudied elements of the New Left and the Black Panthers, Young Lords, but also Iwar AIM, it is the profoundly multi-ethnic character of these movements. So there were many Latinos in the Black Panther Party who were kind of undercover Latinos. And I remember asking one of the members of the Young Lords, Panama, who's Panamanian, how is it that a Panamanian is involved in an organization that identifies as a revolutionary nationalist a Puerto Rican revolutionary nationalist organization? And his response to me was, this was the age of Che Guevara, an Argentinian man who fought in the Cuban Revolution. So it was very natural for me, someone who lived in New York, grew up with Puerto Ricans, who was aware or became aware of the colonial condition of Puerto Rico, to fight for Puerto Rican independence. And the Young Lords were not just about Puerto Rican independence, they were also socialists who were doing an enormous amount of community organizing at the community level around issues of social and economic import. I don't know if I've answered your questions. Someone else? Yes.
Yeah, I'm interested, throughout your talk in hearing your reflections on what we can learn about building mass organizations or organizing people on a massive scale in terms of their structure, their culture, and their politics. What can we learn from them in the process?
That's $1 million question. So what can we learn from the Young Lords and how they organized in terms of politics, culture, and organization and structure? I address some of those things in the conclusion of the book that I don't even remember what it was that I wrote. But, it's a long book, so... So last summer, a wave of historic protests unseated the governor of Puerto Rico, Ricardo Rosselló, and I imagine that some of you followed the incredible protests. Over 1 million people joined marches, and these were the largest demonstrations in Puerto Rico's history. And resistance took endlessly creative forms. Puerto Ricans protested on horseback, by jet ski, while paddleboarding, scuba diving, skydiving, on motorcade, y hasta perreo en la fortaleza, and even in the form of a twerk battalion at the governor's mansion. Those events were intoxicating to watch. They recalled that brilliant quote by the Russian revolutionary Vladimir Lenin when he wrote about the Russian Revolution, quote, "There are decades when nothing happens. There are weeks when decades happen," unquote. In the case of Puerto Rican resistance, change happened in days, not weeks, all in reaction to the unforgiving crisis Puerto Ricans have suffered and continue to suffer in the time of Maria under U.S. colonial rule. And I'll just say that when I got here to Baltimore, I recalled those incredible riots. And I don't know that they were riots, they were rebellions in 2015, when young black men in Baltimore pelted the cops with rocks. There was a battle in the streets. I imagine you all remember. Those were profoundly powerful and fierce protests that really changed consciousness in the country and the world. Lenin also called these moments of mass upheavals festivals of the oppressed, because when masses of ordinary people begin to take collective action outside of the normal channels of society, they gain a sense of their power. When everyday people come to see themselves as agents of change and makers of history, all of a sudden the ideas of the old society and the boundaries society imposes on who we are and how we live completely evaporate. And I have here some photographs that you might recall and remember from the demonstrations that happened in 2006, when millions of people from Latin America, undocumented immigrants, essentially protested out of the blue. These were the largest civil rights demonstrations in U.S. history up to that date. And this is a demonstration in Salt Lake City, Utah, by the way, in 2006, something that no one imagined. Who knew that there were so many people from Latin America, so many undocumented immigrants in a city like Salt Lake City? These are demonstrations across the country that we've forgotten. And these were some of the signs that were that were created by activists in that period. And it's important to note that immigrants, undocumented immigrants, built these demonstrations in the United States underground, and they used the radio and radio networks in Spanish to build these incredible demonstrations. I'll continue with my remarks. In order to maintain the status quo, society produces citizens who resign themselves to their social weakness and do not imagine that society can be organized differently. But social movements and revolutions change this. They bring people together, they neutralize alienation, they encourage critical thinking and problem solving, they unleash creativity on a mass scale and bring forth previously unimaginable freedom dreams. Proposals, essentially, for how we might fundamentally transform and rebuild society. They also connect people to their deepest humanity. And one of the most incredible things that I learned when I was interviewing young lords, and I've interviewed approximately 100 or so young lords, but also people who worked with them, is that what they retained was a profound sense of connectedness and love for humanity. And that experience that they conveyed to me in their writings inspired this project all these years. And I think I want to acknowledge a young lord who's here in the house. Faisal is with us. So if we could give him a round of applause. So who were the Young Lords? The Young Lords are the Puerto Rican counterpart of the Black Panther Party. In its first incarnation, the Young Lords was a gang in Chicago of mostly Mexican and Puerto Rican youth. So these are the Black Panthers, but that photograph that came before, that's not a Black Panther, that's in fact a Young Lord. And the Young Lords are important in part because it was one of the most profoundly diverse organizations of the period. 30% of the membership of the organization was non-Puerto Rican. They were African Americans and other Latinos. So the Young Lords was transformed into a political organization by its leader, Jose Chacha Jimenez, in collaboration with others, including Fred Hampton. This is an article about Chacha Jimenez that appeared in the Black Panther newspaper in 1969, which young Puerto Ricans read about in New York, and that article inspired them to travel to Chicago to meet this Chacha Jimenez, who had transformed a gang into a political organization. The organization spread to New York. This is Chacha Jimenez. And this is the Rainbow Coalition that was built in Chicago by Fred Hampton, the leader of the Chicago chapter of the Black Panther Party. And these are other members of the original Rainbow Coalition, which was a coalition that included Puerto Ricans and Mexicans in the Young Lords, Black Americans in the Black Panther Party, but also members of the Young Patriots, an organization of poor whites from Appalachia in Chicago, organized across racial lines on the basis of class interests. This is the Young Lords in Chicago during one of their first campaigns. They occupied a police department. And this is the group of young people who launched the organization in New York City. And this is Juan Gonzalez of Democracy Now! He's going to come up a few times. So the organization spread to New York, where it was led by a cohort of very talented, poor, and working class youth, the first in their families to attend college. So in New York City, the organization was a political organization from the start. And the first chapter of my book tells the story of the radicalization of a gang and its transformation epic transformation into a political organization. In New York, it was mostly first-generation college students who led and built the organization. They got permission to build a chapter of the Young Lords when they traveled to Chicago to meet Chacha Jimenez. In New York, they were the children of poor and working-class Puerto Rican migrants who had been massively displaced from the island of Puerto Rico to the United States mainland after World War II. So these are the Young Lords in New York. They grew up in poor neighborhoods like the South Bronx and East Harlem and were radicalized by, this is the Young Lords, one of their demonstrations. The Young Lords, like others of the New Left, were radicalized by the civil rights and Black Power movements, but also by the Vietnam War. So 50 years ago, at the end of the 1960s in New York, and we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Young Lords as we speak, 50 years ago, this generation of socialist youth made it their top priority to make revolution here in the United States and on the island of Puerto Rico. And the Young Lords is singular as an organization of the New Left, in part because they built a movement here domestically in the United States, but then in 1971, they transferred their operation to Puerto Rico in order to fight for Puerto Rican independence. They formed part of a generation that saw war and imperialism abroad, racism and class inequality at home, and suffering the world over, and joined the fight for human liberation. Understanding who they were in relation to the nation drove their project. In the process of fighting for a better world, they discovered who their parents were and why so many of their parents had left Puerto Rico. They learned that the island of Puerto Rico was the oldest colony in the world, colonized first by the Spaniards in 1508 and recolonized by the United States in 1898. They discovered that the nature of U.S. interests in Puerto Rico was geostrategic in character. Throughout the course of the 20th century, the U.S. launched all of its military interventions in Latin America from military bases in Puerto Rico. And part of what I'm trying to do right now is take you through the process of understanding who they were that the Young Lords went through. So they grew up in New York, in neighborhoods like East Harlem and the South Bronx, detached from an understanding of what Puerto Rico was. And part of why they're so iconic and why they grew enormously is because they gave their generation the language to understand the condition that brought their parents to America. And I guess it's going to take another generation of radicals, Latinos in this country, to understand and put a finger on the mass migration of people from Latin America in the aftermath of the North American Free Trade Agreement. They learned that Puerto Rico was also the place where the U.S. tested and developed the blueprint for capitalist development and expansion in the so-called third world economies during the Cold War. So in 1947, that project, an industrialization project of the island, Operation Bootstrap, displaced more farmers than it absorbed into the Puerto Rican economy. The project's contingency plan, however, encouraged the mass transfer of Puerto Ricans from the island to cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia. A third of the people of the island were displaced by Operation Bootstrap in 1947, and more Puerto Ricans migrated to New York between 1947 and 1960 than did African Americans. So when people write about the history of Puerto Ricans and the Puerto Rican diaspora, they actually state that the massive transfer of humanity from Puerto Rico to the U.S. mainland during this period was greater than the massive transfer of humanity in terms of proportion of European immigrants in the late 19th century, when 25 million European immigrants settled in the United States. So a third of the people of the island were displaced. Upon arrival in the United States, mainland, these migrants faced another series of displacements. Urban renewal, which was that era's version of gentrification, the rise of permanent unemployment as a consequence of deindustrialization, dilapidated housing, police brutality, super exploitation in the city's garment industry, where 70% of Puerto Ricans worked, and the attempt on the part of the city to strip Puerto Ricans of their dignity. Part of what's been fascinating for me to see is that if you read the newspapers of the time, Puerto Ricans were depicted in the media much like Mexicans have been depicted in this period, as bad hombres, criminals, but also mild-mannered people. So you might not recall, but 7 years ago, Mexicans were depicted as mild-mannered people because they are the super exploited class in American society who are vulnerable to deportation. Well, Puerto Ricans worked the hardest jobs in New York. They were super exploited. They were known as mild-mannered, but eventually they were demonized, criminalized, and part of what the Young Lords did was that they essentially stood up for Puerto Ricans and transformed the perception of Puerto Ricans in New York City through their militant organizing. The Young Lords exposed these unforgiving conditions, linked them to U.S. colonial rule in Puerto Rico, to capitalism and imperial war in places like Vietnam. And in the context of radicalization and the growing awareness that Puerto Ricans were colonial subjects, the children of Puerto Rican migration explored the commonality of experience between Puerto Ricans and African Americans. So these are some of the demonstrations that, if you can go back, and activism that the Young Lords engaged in. On the ground, the Young Lords became known for their militant and dramatic community-based organizing. In Chicago, the Young Lords helped beat back urban renewal. In New York, they engaged in militant community organizing around medical discrimination in the area of health. They blocked traffic with neighborhood garbage to protest poor sanitation conditions. They exposed childhood lead poisoning. They took over a hospital, Lincoln Hospital in the Bronx. And they drafted the first known patient Bill of Rights. And they are credited with the passage of anti-lead poisoning legislation in New York. And they did all of this in collaboration with workers in hospitals, technicians, but also doctors, and they engaged in militant action in the streets, but they also went door to door testing children for lead poisoning, and they exposed the fact that something like 30% of the children they tested in New York were lead positive, and as you know, lead poisoning lead is a neurotoxin that causes permanent brain damage. And there were a series of children who died in East Harlem because of lead poisoning. And they just muckraked and exposed the crisis in the streets through press conferences. They occupied the office of the Department of Health, and eventually they took over a hospital to dramatize the horrific conditions of health in the city. And they called their campaigns offensives in solidarity with the Tet Offensive of the Vietnamese in 1968. For example, they called the garbage offensive, the garbage campaign, the garbage offensive. And as you might know, the Tet Offensive was the most important military operation launched by the Vietnamese in 1968. It was the campaign that took the cities and that surprised Americans in the cities rather than in the jungle, as the Vietnamese were engaged in struggle in the jungle. And they lost, the Vietnamese lost the military operation, but it was actually captured by the media in the city, and with that offensive, others began to challenge U.S. imperialism around the world, But the United States intervention in Vietnam pretty much began to grind to a halt after that. So what were the politics of the Young Lords? And I think it's important to note that they emerged in 1969, both in Chicago and New York, at the height of radicalization during this period. They were not only community organizers, they were revolutionaries who were combining the idea of building a broad social movement with the notion of building a revolutionary party. This is important because historically, the socialist tradition in the United States has done one thing or the other. There have been very few moments wherein socialists have been able to successfully build community-based or workplace-based campaigns and retain a structure of revolutionary politics. And the Young Lords were successful because they were able to do both. They built community campaigns, they build a broader movement, but they also build a revolutionary party. And they are among the few waves of socialists who are people of color who built movements in the United States. They were doing this at a moment when 2 million students said that they believed in the importance of building a revolutionary party, so that helped tremendously, that consciousness had moved profoundly to the left by the end of the 1960s. And they were also self-identified revolutionary nationalists who championed the independence of Puerto Rico. They called themselves Marxist-Leninists, and they were influenced by the Cuban Revolution. This is the church they occupied, by the way. They also occupied a church, and they used the media to essentially convince people of East Harlem that it was a good idea that they were taking over a church, and I can talk about that some more. If you can move forward, this is the breakfast program that they established. They turned the church into a social sanctuary for the poor, held free community clinics at the church, and here they're trying to build socialism in the hospital that they occupied in the Bronx. They were influenced by social service politics of the period, but they married this social service-oriented activism to a revolutionary socialist politics. They're influenced by the Cuban Revolution, and this is something that folks might not recognize, that the Black Panthers wore berets in solidarity with the Cuban Revolution. They also published a newspaper, which they called Palante, and they developed the 13-point program and platform that mirrored it was different from the Black Panther 10-point program, but ultimately the Young Lords were successful because they adopted the structure of organization and political model pre-established by the Black Panther Party. They essentially mimicked the organizational form of the Black Panther Party, and that allowed them to take off as they did with the community organizing. The first point of their platform read, "We want self-determination for Puerto Ricans, liberation on the island and inside the United States." Its final point, number 13, read, "We want a socialist society." For the purposes of this talk, I want to underscore that the Young Lords, like the Black Panthers, were socialists. And this is important for thinking about the question asked, what's the significance of the Young Lords and the Black Panthers for this period, especially given that we're in election season? So what this means is that they believe that society should be organized around human need, not on the basis of profit as under capitalism, and that workers and ordinary people could democratically reorganize society and run it in the interests of the many. When they looked around the world to assess problems, they emphasized that class conflict is central and universal in society. In other words, that the world is divided between the poor and the rich, that working people produce all the goods and services in society, but that the rich and their governments control how those goods are distributed and what the priorities of society are. And that only a revolution could resolve this fundamental conflict and inequality. They emphasize that classes exist among racially oppressed people. Therefore, they decried conservative and cultural forms of nationalism, which called for unity on the basis of race and ethnicity alone, as in the example of declaring Puerto Rican independence only to build Puerto Rican capitalism. And they also drew from the example of the Black Panthers, who called cultural nationalists pork chop nationalists and lambasted them for being more concerned with making money selling dashikis than with real revolution. So these are the articles that they published in their newspapers. They were reading all kinds of literature, Marxist literature, but also the literature emerging from third world liberation movements. And they were people from the communities in which they were organizing who wrote articles in a language that was very accessible to and a style that reflected the culture in which they lived. So they were really organically grounded in the community. These were people from the community who became revolutionaries and went back to the community to organize among the people in workplaces and in the schools. These are some of the articles in the paper. So social movements and their organizations are measured in terms of impact. I was just asked earlier, how long did the Young Lords last? How long were they around? The Young Lords were around for a nanosecond. They emerged in 1971. In 1969, by 1971, they had left to Puerto Rico, and the organization pretty much died down by 1974 as a result of government infiltration. But movements are not measured in terms of duration. They're measured in terms of impact and the extent to which they shift consciousness. They transform the public debate about what's accepted or not and how we understand social problems, but also how we live. And this is why the New Left is so important. So the Young Lords are part of the New Left, and we don't consistently study the 60s necessarily in American society. We don't necessarily get to the 60s in high school, and a lot of college professors don't teach the 60s. But the 60s are important because they produced a cultural revolution in the United States. In many ways, they civilized American society. The New Left radically changed the relationship between white people and people of color in the United States. This is why the New Left matters. So the New Left changed the relationship between white people and people of color, and in particular, the relationship between white people and black people, which is why folks get fired today when they say racist things, because the civil rights and black power movements establish different standards for how we conduct ourselves in public. Racism and white supremacy became unacceptable in American society. It's the reason why Obama became president and why, for example, someone like Ellen is as popular as she is. So the 60s also made acceptable a questioning of U.S. foreign policy. This is in the aftermath of the Cold War, where it wasn't acceptable to criticize American foreign policy, but it also challenged the nation's assumptions about issues of gender and sexuality. So everything that we accept as normal, even despite the existence of Trump in office, but everything we accept as normal, the fact that I'm here, that I teach at a university as a black woman, that Ellen is in the public sphere, all of these cultural changes were a result of these fierce struggles that happened in the 1960s. I'll end with a significant portion of my book, part of what I learned pretty early on, which is something that is not necessarily acknowledged, is that a lot of the activism of the Young Lords and the Black Panthers was organized around health. And I was one of the first people to actually write about this. I wrote an article about this more than 10 years ago because it was puzzling. It's not necessarily something that you expect young, fierce revolutionaries with a lot of testosterone doing, right? When we think about these organizations, they're at least perceived as very masculine, macho organizations. How is it that they end up doing all of this work around health? And even though we don't realize this trend was begun by the Black Panther Party. So the Black Panther Party organized ambulance services in cities like Pittsburgh. They did tuberculosis testing. They did work around lead poisoning. It was the Black Panther Party that initiated protests at Lincoln Hospital. They took, before the Young Lords got there, they took over a mental health clinic to organize it in the interests of the people. And you probably don't know this, but that's why the Panther 21 were arrested. So you know about the Panther 21. All of the members of the Panther 21 had been engaged in the occupation and takeover of a mental health clinic in the Bronx before the police, the NYPD, zeroed in on them and arrested them all. That pretty much led to the decline of activism on the part of the Black Panther in New York City. And the Young Lords then took the helm and continued with the work around health. So as the children, and this is what I concluded, why health? And I was just trying to put the puzzle together for quite some time. As the children of the first large wave of non-English speaking Puerto Rican migrants to the city, the Young Lords and their peers grew up bilingual. They were indispensable language and cultural interpreters who helped their parents and neighbors navigate the inhospitable bureaucratic institutions of New York. And the New York hospitals were among the most frequented of such institutions, second only to the public schools. The Young Lords during the period describe enduring alienating visits to hospitals as children, where as intermediaries for their parents, they were able to perceive at a very young age, quote, how these institutions viewed us versus how we viewed ourselves. As children, they witnessed the stigma and indignity of discrimination, of long waiting hours at the emergency room, and the improper care their parents received, all in the context of illness when people feel most human and most vulnerable. And part of what I argue in the book is that the experience of this generation of young migrants in these public institutions, in the schools, in the hospitals, in the streets, establish the foundation of an organic early radicalization that then matured and became organized as a consequence of the rise of the civil rights movement. So Puerto Ricans, unlike other Latinos, they migrated into the civil rights and Black Power movements and anti-war movements and were profoundly influenced by the period. This experience of these young people translating for their parents in hospitals that had not yet been civilized rankled them to the core. And this wasn't just any period. The demographic shifts and economic changes of the post-war period created a health crisis of epic proportion for the city and its poor and working class people. So you probably know that the post-World War II period produced a city that was poorer and more divided by race and class than ever before in the history of the city because of white flight. So there was not just white flight, there was also a process of deindustrialization happening in cities like Baltimore, New York, Philadelphia, Chicago. We tend to think of deindustrialization as a white working class thing, but before deindustrialization hit white workers, it devastated communities of color, because deindustrialization began to take root in American cities immediately after World War II in cities like Detroit, New York, etc. So independently of the experience of racism, which itself is a complex health risk, these new migrants of color were undergoing a series of displacements which would have profound consequences for their physical and mental health. Displacement abounded in the form of Operation Bootstrap. Migration is a profound displacement. And this happened not just to Puerto Ricans, but also to Mexicans who were migrating to the city during this period, and Black Americans who were migrating from the South. Deindustrialization is another mass displacement, but also urban renewal. Not sure if you know that 22,000 Puerto Rican families were displaced from the neighborhood where Lincoln Center was built in New York City. In 1959, urban renewal, gentrification of that time, essentially raised one of the most vibrant Puerto Rican neighborhoods, known for its street performers and its drummers. And in the rubble was filmed West Side Story, by the way. In the rubble of that very vibrant neighborhood, they filmed West Side Story. The filmmakers of West Side Story decided to do the filming there, but then Lincoln Center was built. Social psychiatrist Dr. Mindy Fullilove calls social displacement, quote, root shock. This is what she writes. Root shock, she explains, quote, undermines trust, increases anxiety, destabilizes relationships, destroys social, emotional, and financial resources, and increases the risk of every kind of stress-related disease, from depression to heart attack. Unsurprisingly, in the 1960s, poor Black Americans and Puerto Ricans began to make more trips to New York's hospitals than white Americans. This was the moment when, for the first time, urban people began to use emergency rooms for all manner of non-emergency conditions. You know, we know the statistics that people of color use the emergency room as their doctor. Well, this was the moment when it started, in part because these changes were completely new, this massive displacement. The exponential increase of these visits was fueled by the higher risk of, the higher incidence of sickness as a consequence of root shock, but also, I mean, I literally spent years trying to figure this out. During this period, part of what we see is white flight to the suburbs. But who leaves with white flights? The mom and pop corner doctors. So in neighborhoods like East Harlem and Harlem, what we see is a 30% decrease in doctors who had previously served poor European immigrant populations. But now the corner doctors were gone. They left with white flight out of the city. And so people of color were forced for the first time to go to hospitals for care, the new migrants, in ways that previous generations of migrants to the cities had not. And part of what we see in hospitals is a more kind of structural racism, where you're being funneled into a process that truly has not been civilized. So the medical profession in this period was quite prejudiced, even if you weren't a person of color. So everyone complained about doctors and their horrible manners and their unwillingness to treat patients like human beings, and to not condescend to them and to explain to them what their medical problem was and what their options were. That was not part of the story of medical care in the United States until, in fact, organizations like the Young Lords started protesting in hospitals for the racism that their parents and their loved ones were experiencing. Part of the reason why people of color are also going to the hospital in larger numbers is because of the passage of healthcare legislation, Medicaid, essentially, and its passage in the 60s makes medical care available in ways that it hadn't been available to people of color, African Americans and Puerto Ricans. So what this all means is that the Young Lords and their generation may have experienced more stress and discrimination than previous generations because of all of these changes, because they operated as intermediaries for their parents at a moment of greater contact between people of color and the predominantly white staff of New York hospitals before the social movements had established more civilized rules of contact between hospitals and poor populations. Medical discrimination was one of the major issues articulated by the Young Lords in their first ever drafted medical, the Patient Bill of Rights. The confluence of deepening structural health problems with the civil rights and Black Power movements explains why issues of public health were so central to the debates and activism of the 1960s. We tend to associate civil rights, Black Power protests with narrowly defined issues of racial discrimination. But if we look closely, these movements were concerned with issues of social and economic import. In fighting for their rights as human beings in the public hospitals, these activists broadened our definition of democracy and equality. So part of what I argue in my book is that we don't tend to think about this. But part of what the Young Lords and the Black Panthers and the Black Power movement did was that it expanded the notion and definition of freedom in America to include something like how you should and might be treated in a public hospital. Again, something not necessarily associated with the Black Panther Party or the civil rights movement, but part of what we learn if we actually study these movements at the granular level is that they influence every aspect of American life. So the protests that the Young Lords launched in New York around garbage collection, wherein they stopped traffic for blocks on end by burning garbage in the streets and encouraged the neighborhood to partake, forced the city to develop a much more rigorous system of garbage collection that includes alternate side of the street parking. This is what I learned from the archive. And the Young Lords and their muckraking is credited and reported in the New York Times. And it's even cited during the mayoral debates that happened in 1969 when they were doing the muckraking. So I'll end by saying that essentially radicals in the 60s expanded the nation's definition of the common good around sanitation and the notion that we have a right to decent services offered and extended by the city. And the Patient Bill of Rights is an example of that. And before I end, I just want to read from the Patient Bill of Rights. The Young Lords, by the way, did an enormous amount of work alongside of the Black Panthers, but the Black Panthers were mired in the campaign of repression that was homicidal, launched by the COINTELPRO. But they did an enormous amount of work around incarceration and the rights of prisoners before Attica. So there were a series of riots in the prisons in New York in 1970. And at around the same time, a young lord was found hanged at the Tombs, the infamous New York City jail. And they took over the church again with arms and forced the mayor of New York to launch the first ever investigation of the killing of a prisoner in a New York City jail. And they took over the church with arms the second time, and out of the church they ran a prisoners' rights legal clinic. So in many ways, the Young Lords, because they are betwixt and between periods, their activism reflected the old and the new. In many ways, the character and style of their protests looks a lot like the activism of ACT UP in the 1980s. I'll read from the Patient Bill of Rights that they drafted, the first ever that I know of. And they drafted it at Lincoln Hospital with workers and doctors. To be treated with dignity and respect. To have all treatment explained and to refuse any treatment you feel is not in your best interest. To know what medicine is being prescribed and what it is for and what side effects it will cause. This is all that we take for granted today, but all of this was imagined, fought for in this period. To have access to your medical chart, to have door-to-door preventative medicine programs, and this they were taking from the example of the Cuban Revolution. To choose the doctor you want to have and to have the same doctor treat you all the time. This is a crisis in public hospitals, that there's a revolving door of care by different doctors. To call your doctor to your home. To receive free meals while waiting for outpatient service. To have free daycare centers in all hospital facilities. To receive free health care. Ultimately, there's a lot to be said about the Young Lords. Among many, many other things, they fought for the highest aspirations of humanity. Thank you.
Fascinating, no less than fascinating. We're going to have some question and answers, and we have a period of time for that, but it's not forever. So we ask that you keep your question or comment very truncated and to the point. There's much that we could talk about and unpack, and we won't have time to do all of that. So please keep your questions or answers very brief and to the point. And again, the book is on sale in the back, and afterwards you will be able to bring it up to get it signed here at the front. And I'll do a couple more closing announcements in a few minutes. But if you wish to ask something, we have a microphone set up here. As with anything at Red Emmons, we encourage the diversity of folk at the mic. But if you do have something very brief to ask, you should come on up. While you are doing that, I will go ahead and say, first of all, it is encouraging to hear about the successes. Because those of us on the left, as you know, we
don't have many of those.
No, exactly. We get used to the defeats. It's fascinating to hear about the successes that I did not know about. Could you say a word or two? You may have touched on it, but could you unpack a little bit more the role of women in the Young Lords? And I think many of us, we think about the Panthers and some of the things pro and con and some of the issues that have been impacted, in the years since by women that were in the Panthers and that type of thing. But say something about the role of women in the Young Lords, similarities or differences, and what that was about.
Okay, so chapter 8 of the book is on the politics of race and gender in the organization. So there were women in the organization in New York and in Chicago from the beginning. In fact, in Chicago, the gang had a female auxiliary group. And in many ways, the launch of this female auxiliary group of the gang helped politicize it. And I tell that story in chapter 1. In New York, there were women in the organization from the beginning. And in fact, because the Young Lords emerged in 1969 after second wave feminists made their mark, the organization was forced to reflect the issue of women's equality in the drafting of its 13-point program. So its 13-point program, point number 10 says, down with machismo must be revolutionary, which was a contradiction that the women of the Young Lords who were present didn't quite catch. They co-signed on that 13-point program and this issue of revolutionary machismo. The major campaign that led to the massive expansion of the organization was the occupation of the church the first time in December 1969. They occupied the church for 11 days, and they made a big splash. Everyone in the movement visited the Young Lords. So the attorney of Huey P. Newton was arrested, was in prison at that time. But he sent a message that his lawyer read. All of the famous people, Kathleen Cleaver, but also movie stars, went to the church and made their speeches. The news was all over this because it was, you couldn't keep away from the drama of revolutionaries occupying a church. And so in many ways, this was the big coming out party for the Puerto Rican community that shifted the perception of Puerto Ricans in New York from mild-mannered to people that you can't mess with. And so after the church occupation, the number of women in the organization expanded exponentially. And women started meeting after the church occupation on Sunday alone in women's circles, influenced by second wave feminists, the consciousness raising circle. And the women say that the men were like, sure, go ahead, go have your hen meetings. But that was essentially the cell of women's liberation and women's resistance that 3 months later challenged the male leadership of the Young Lords. They drafted a 10-point program on all of the ways in which the organization needed to change to reflect its women's membership. And the first point of that 10-point program and demand to the men of the organization was that revolutionary can't be machismo, that this is a contradiction of epic proportion, and that we need to destroy the patriarchy and machismo, and you need to elect a woman to the leadership body of the organization. And that woman became Denise Oliver, who's not Puerto Rican, who's African American, a Black American member of the organization who had been in the organization from the beginning. But what's fascinating about the Young Lords is that they created women's and men's caucuses within the organization that was mandatory to attend to discuss issues of patriarchy and sexism. They also published a series of articles during this period on women's liberation, the origins of women's oppression, but also the relationship between colonialism and women's oppression, and the fact that a disproportionate number of Puerto Rican and African American women had been sterilized in the South and in Puerto Rico, that the pill had been tested in Puerto Rico, which became the pharmaceutical capital of the world. So they developed a practice of challenging sexism among the members, the male members of the Young Lords, but they also theorized the experience of oppression for women of color, in particular Puerto Rican women. I don't know if that answers your question. It's a really rich story it's a lot more complicated too. So Denise Oliver is African American, but she was a black red diaper baby, whose parents were fellow followers of the Communist Party in the 1950s. And she came to the organization with an enormous amount of experience politically. She had also been involved in SNCC and the Southern Civil Rights Movement. And she was elected to be the officer of the day. So the Black Panthers and the Young Lords had a paramilitary structure. And the officer of the day, which is a military designation, was in charge of everything that happened in the organization that day. You're giving out assignments for people to go give talks. You're making sure that the newspaper is being sold. So the Young Lords and the Black Panthers sold newspapers daily, and they had a route, and they were able to keep half the money of the newspaper for themselves to live, because they all lived collectively and no one worked. And so because the guy who was the officer of the day couldn't do his job, he was fired, and Denise Oliver took his job. And that gave her an enormous amount of power and made her very prominent as a woman of the organization. So part of what I argue is that, you know, this was just something that happened haphazardly, that a woman took the job because she could do it. And this really propelled the woman to a leadership role and established the basis for organizing a woman's cell that that also ultimately brought down the patriarchy within the Young Lords. Ironically and horrifically, and this is the story I tell in the last chapter, it was a woman in the organization by the name of Gloria Rodriguez who made it all the way to the top. Who led to the demise of the Young Lords and ended up marrying a member of COINTELPRO. And she deployed violence like it was hotcakes in the organization. And that led to its demise. Yes. Oh, yeah. Oh, that's a picture of Denise right there.
Wanted to mention, since locally, you might know Denise Oliver from being one of the people who organized WPFW and was the first program director for WPFW.
The first program director for WPFW. So Denise Oliver is legendary for all of the work she's done. She did an enormous amount of work for Black radio after she left the Young Lords. But before she left the Young Lords, she joined the Black Panther Party and traveled with Kathleen Cleaver around Africa with the international section of the Black Panther Party. And when she returned, she started to work in media, in part because of the emphasis of the Young Lords on media and influencing consciousness through the new media of the period. Any other observations, questions? Yes.
I noticed, well, first of all, you know, of course, tomorrow is the 55th anniversary of the assassination of Malcolm. And of course, there were a bunch of photographs and illustrations of Malcolm in your presentation. So could you connect some of the dots between Malcolm and the Young Lords, et cetera?
So like the Black Panthers, the Young Lords considered themselves the children of Malcolm. Literally. They call themselves the children of Malcolm, and they wrote articles about that and the meaning of that in their newspaper. And that was important for Puerto Ricans because there was an enormous amount of anti-Black racism among Puerto Ricans that the Young Lords challenged through their newspaper. So they published articles about the Black American experience and the significance of the Black American experience in their newspaper, but they also were among the first Latinos to theorize racism and its emergence as an ideology in Latin America, something that's extremely popular now. And part of what the Young Lords did was that they made public an issue that was taboo and that was limited to whispers within the African American community about Blackness. So they exposed anti-Black racism, but also the denial of Blackness among Puerto Ricans and other Latinos. You probably know something about the history of Latin America and an island like the Dominican Republic, wherein its population denies its Blackness. So they theorized, they wrote about that, and they also traced pretty amazing stuff. They traced the African roots of Puerto Rican culture by literally writing articles about the African elements in Puerto Rican language, and Native American roots of Puerto Rican words like enagua and a series of words that have Native American and African roots. They pointed that out. They wrote articles about Loíza, which is an African district in Puerto Rico, and its significance to the DNA of Puerto Rican culture, something that has been historically denied. So they did an enormous amount of anthropological and political work to challenge racism and to theorize the ways in which racism emerges differently under colonial rule than it did here in the United States under British rule. So they studied the institution of slavery in both Latin America and the United States, and deployed the power of comparison to challenge race ideology. I mean, it's pretty amazing. And they mandated political education around these issues. And one young lord told me the story of how actually Jaja, can we go back to Jaja? So Jaja was a Korean, a veteran from the Korean War. So Jaja was a veteran from the Korean War. He's the first Black Panther young lord that I identified. Up more, one or two more. One there. That's Jaja. So this is Jaja, who's a veteran from the Korean War. He was a young lord. He was very helpful. And one young lord tells me that a female young lord who had a child became very nervous when Jaja was assigned to childcare because he was Black. And the organization opened that up and turned it into a political conversation and talked about the myths of around Black men in American society, the Black rapist, and it became the subject of internal debate and discussion and an opportunity to fight racism internally within the organization. And they did an enormous amount of political education. So one of the things they did was that they, and you can talk about this, I mean, we have a young lord here who can just say, but there was a rigorous program of political education that was mandated like once or twice a week. So there was political education hour during which you were not expected to be in conversation with others, you were expected to read. So there was a reading hour. They lived collectively. But then there was mandated political education internally and with the community.
So to say that we only have just a few minutes, so for our three, I'll make these last, unless there's a woman or female presenting person who wants to jump in the question line, these will be the last three, and if we can keep it real truncated, we'll
And I'll let you all articulate your questions.
Yeah, so thank you for your work and for being here. I was you mentioned the church occupations.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the role of religion and spirituality in the Young Lords.
Okay, yes, thank you. Go ahead. Oh, yeah, no, go ahead. Remind me.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think my question, when I think about the Young Lords, the thing that's most fascinating to me is just how they started out as a street gang and then transitioned to this political organization, not only because I think for a lot of people, a street gang is maybe the last place they think of, this political movement coming from. But just looking at the pictures, so many of them are also just so young, just, teenagers or early 20s. So if you could talk about also just that transition they made from, that street gang into this political organization.
Okay. So the transition, so the average age of the Young Lords was like 16 and 17. Young Lords were 14, 13, 15. They were among the youngest cohort within the New Left.
You mentioned COINTELPRO, the FBI program that took down the Black Panthers, and you mentioned how it was also involved with the Young Lords. Could you elaborate a little bit more on exactly how specifically the FBI took down the young lords in that regard.
Okay, so that's a long story. By the way, I knew that there were police records of the young lords, and I did a Freedom of Information law request to the NYPD like 14 years ago, and for literally 10 years they kept telling me that they were on it. So literally I'm like from New York, so I show up to One Police Plaza, and I'm like, listen, I'm like you, I'm from New York, can I get these records, please? And they're like, yes, they're very respectful. Yes, Professor Fernandez, we know about your request, and we were on it, in fact. So I called them back a month later because I gotten nowhere, and I didn't get the response that they said they were going to send me. And then they say again, yes, we got you. And then 3 months later, they send me a letter saying that they were going to dismiss my request on a technicality. So I was pissed off. I was like, how dare you? I'm from New York and I'm a professor. And so I sued them. Like I literally... I was just angry, and this was around the Black Lives Matter movement. I was just angry. I literally borrowed money and sued them. I didn't know what I was getting into. So I got into a court battle with the cops for 2 years. They were nasty. The judge was on my side, but had to dismiss the case because she literally had the cops photograph everywhere where they looked for the records that I was asking for. The records I was asking for form part of the Handshoe files, 1 million records of police surveillance. Anyway, so the judge says, listen, I've done everything. It's been 2 years. I've had them photograph everywhere where they've looked. What else can I do? And so we leave the courtroom. I'm all crestfallen, and my lawyer says, okay, well, we tried. And I'm like, what? We tried? Absolutely not. We're going to win. And he was like, well, let's go to New York 1. You guys know New York 1? It's like the CNN of New York. It's local news all the time of all the different boroughs. So we show up. The guy that interviews me, I know him because he originally was assigned to the Bronx beat where I'm from. I make a connection with him around that, but now he's the big boss at New York 1. And he says to me, interviews me, amazing, the whole thing. And I'm leaving to the Dominican Republic, like right now. So he's like, you know what? The police department has a press conference right now. I'm going to go and ask them about your files. He goes, I go to the Dominican Republic. 3 hours later, my phone is like blowing up because this is all over New York 1. He went to the press conference, cross-examined the chief of the police, and 2 weeks later, the Handshoe files, over 1 million records of police surveillance, including the police surveillance of Malcolm X, show up. So they're now available at the Municipal Archive of the City of New York. So part of what we learned, and I had gotten the COINTELPRO files, those are the federal files. Essentially, the police worked with COINTELPRO. COINTELPRO would not have been able to do its job without the police because all movements are local. So there was surveillance of the young lords from the very beginning. So when the young lords in New York decide that they are going to build an office and they're going to rent, what do you call the front of a building? What is it called? The storefront. Yes. The COINTELPRO and the police visit the landlord. And so this is all in the COINTELPRO papers. And so they were tracking the young lords, but the young lords, they were popular. They were feared, but they managed to endear themselves to, a journalist, local mainstream journalist. They were very public. They got the community involved. They were in the streets. And so the police were limited in what they did to the young lords. But ultimately, it was when the young lords left to Puerto Rico that their base eroded. It was when they isolated themselves that COINTELPRO was able to infiltrate the organization. Another very important answer to this question is that the Young Lords and the Black Panthers had a system for identifying agents. You couldn't become a Young Lord. Essentially, the test for whether you were going to cut the mustard was whether you could get up at 5 o'clock to serve breakfast to children. They also had, you were also a friend of the Lord, and later a young lord in training. And there was a system that was actually inspired by the Black Panthers for figuring out who the agents were. I don't know if I've answered your question, but it was pretty bad. Part of the issue, the strategy that COINTELPRO used was that it eroded trust among people who considered themselves brothers and sisters. And they used interpersonal relationships to do that, like amorous relationships. It's just nasty and tragic. Okay, the church. The Young Lords were Catholics, right? Many of them were raised in the church. Felipe Luciano was literally a young minister and an evangelical, raised in an evangelical household. And Juan Gonzalez was a choir boy. So part of what they did was that they quoted scripture. They took over the church and said, it was Jesus who said that it was easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. Like literally they quoted scripture left and right, and they were pretty sophisticated in how they did it, and their major demand was to initiate a breakfast program in the church. That the pastor happened to be an exile from Cuba. And so this was like perfect drama for the media. And they literally embodied the spirit, the revolutionary spirit of Christianity, and said that if Jesus was a young lord, he would have been, if Jesus had been born today, he would have been a young lord. So they literally used the ideology of the church to make their argument, and they won over the media corps and lots of members of the community, such that people from the community came into the church to cook for the young lords during the first church occupation. And then the third question, the final question, what was the final question? There was a question about the church, about repression. Oh, the gangs. Oh my God. Okay. So this is Felipe Luciano, the leader of the Young Lords. Another thing is that, and I didn't understand this until I curated quite a number of exhibits that forced me to look at the photographs. The Young Lords were disproportionately Afro-Latinos and Afro-Puerto Ricans. So that's why Black members joined, Black Americans joined. Because they saw themselves reflected in the leadership of the organization. The radicalization of the gang is just incredible. First of all, part of what I learned was that the gangs in Chicago that were built by people of color were political, because it was a city where white gangs had been part of like the life and culture and the political structure of the city. So gang members literally later, white gang members in Euro-American gangs joined the NYPD, the Chicago PD. And politicians protected the gangs if the gangs helped them collect the vote. There was an enormous amount of interethnic violence among Italian and German and Polish gangs. So people of color enter this environment where there's an enormous amount of interethnic violence already. They're black and Latino. The young men within these populations of color are forced to join gangs to survive. White resistance to their, to their presence in the city. White supremacy, essentially. And Chicago is pretty crazy, and it was very scary for me to try to figure out the politics of that city. In essence, for people of color who were not politicized, young men, joining a gang was already a political act of self-defense against white rage against their presence in the city. But what I learned then was that it was these gangs of color, including the Young Lords, that integrated spaces like the beach. So Chacha Jimenez tells me, I don't know that the civil rights movement is happening or the Black Power movement. That's not what we're about. But we do know that the beach is right down the street from where we live, but we don't have access to that beach because it's a white-only beach. At some point, we decided that the beach was a block away. Where we had to go was 2 miles away, and we wanted to go to the beach right now. So we went to the beach right now, and we fought white gang members for access to this side of the beach. And that established a model that allowed our parents to, straighten up their backs and stand up for their rights. Like incredible stories of literally desegregating space with brawn. Amazing stories that I tell in that first chapter. This kid, Chacha Jimenez, was arrested 1,000,001 times, and in one of these instances, he was going to go away for 10 years. His mother somehow negotiated a deal with a judge wherein he was sent to Puerto Rico, something we can't imagine now. He was sent to Puerto Rico rather than to jail in a juvenile detention center for 10 years. And part of what he says is this, again, the power of comparison. He's like, in Puerto Rico, I actually stole a horse because I fell in love with a woman, a girl, and she was far away, and the tongue lashing I got from the people in the community was worse than all the jail time I could have done in Chicago. And what I realized, he says, was that why was I being punished differently in Puerto Rico than I was being punished in Chicago? I was thrown away in Chicago, but the community embarrassed me and shamed me, but they didn't isolate me, and that helped me, and that started the process of me asking questions about, why Puerto Rico is the way it is versus Chicago. He, of course, came back to Chicago, was imprisoned again at around the time that Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968. It was in prison that he started reading, at that moment, Malcolm X's autobiography, Martin Luther King's Where Do We Go From Here, but Thomas Merton's 7-Story Mountain. He was Catholic, and his mother wanted him to be a priest. And he was guilty about having gone to prison yet another time. And so in prison, he tells me that he was listening to the radio, because apparently the radio was on in the prison around the time, and he was listening. Everybody, all the guys, he says, listen to like love songs, they're called dusties, old dusties. That's what they call them. But he said in between the old dusties, they played interviews with Fred Hampton of the Black Panther Party. who were fighting the police. And he's like, I know that if someone's fighting the police, I want in on that because the police persecuted us and we were doing wrong things, but they were putting things on us that we didn't do. So when I left, I knew that I wanted to do something like the Black Panther Party, and they somehow met with Fred Hampton, and a series of events which are complicated essentially led to the radicalization of the gang. But initially, he was called the fucking communists, Cha-Cha, by his own fellow gang members. But then one of them got killed by the cops, and the first person they called was Cha-Cha. And so a combination of events in this era of large dreams led to the radicalization of the group. It's a fascinating story that there's no time and I don't even remember the details, but it reads like a movie. This is the thing, that a gang is a very intricate organization with a pre-established network of gangs that it's connected to. So when the young lords were radicalized and they took a stand and they started fighting against urban renewal, their enemies and their friends joined the party, especially when one of their own was killed by the cops. So the young lords were able to build demonstrations of thousands because of this pre-existing network of young people in a period that had experience, that, was undergoing massive radicalization. The same thing happened in East Harlem, and the New York Times and the Village Voice picked up on this, that when the young lords took over the church, gang violence in East Harlem went down. Not unlike what happened during the Black Lives Matter movement when the cops decided to go out on strike in New York. I don't know if you remember this, and crime went down. And everybody went to the demonstration, the massive demonstration in the aftermath of the killing of Eric Garner. In any case, it's a fascinating history. It's a history that took a long time. I feel like I left a piece of my soul in this book, but I hope that I've made the young lords and the history of radicalism and struggle proud. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're going to give another final round of applause in a minute. A few brief announcements before we give a final round of applause. The bookstore is open until 9. What does that mean? That means you only have a few minutes to go buy the remaining